Thanks everybody for joining us today for our CECL webinar. Apologize for a little bit of the technical difficulties, just trying to get the presentation up and going. I'm typically joined by Sean O'Brien every month when we do these CECL webinars, but he is unable to attend today as he is speaking at a conference. So if everyone will bear with me just a couple more seconds, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, it looks like just about everybody's here, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks again for joining us this afternoon. Just a couple things to make note of as we begin, that we are in listen-only mode, so you can hear us, hopefully, but we cannot hear you. If you have any questions, any issues with the audio or video, please go ahead and send me a message in the chat. If you have any questions along the way, you can also stick them right into the chat feature, and I'll take them as they come in or at the end, depending upon timing. So again, my name is Steve Huntington. I am the Director of Analytics here at QwickRate and QwickAnalytics. I have spent my entire career working with community banks across the country, both large and small, in everything from strategic planning, valuation, M&A, and capital advisory to model development and maintenance. And I'd like to point out this year that I am a Wake Forest graduate. It's finally a football team after so many decades of despair, and so excited about that. Typically, again, we have Sean O'Brien joining us as well, but he is unavailable today as he's speaking at a conference, so you just get me today. Just to remind everybody that QwickRate is part of a group of companies underneath the umbrella of QwickRate are QwickAnalytics, which is our analytics platform that you'll be seeing the CECL tool for today, as well as IntelliCredit. And IntelliCredit is a newer division of our company, which is designed to be pretty much kind of on the other side of that wall. The QwickAnalytics products typically deal with publicly available and peer data and those types of metrics based upon call report and other publicly available sources. Whereas IntelliCredit deals much more on the individual loan private data side, whether it's loan review, whether it's loan level CECL tools, or all the other credit products that IntelliCredit provides. So again, the QwickAnalytics platform includes the CECL tool, which we'll be talking about today, as well as a fully fleshed out credit stress test. And then we gather not only call report data from banks and from credit unions as well, but also holding company data, SEC public data, all the data that's publicly available about any financial institutions in the country we have integrated into our platform. And not only do we provide the regulatory type tools like the CECL tool, but also a lot of peer-based and other analytical and credit tools as well. So let's kind of dig into CECL, and I'll give you a background for just a couple minutes before we start talking about and doing sort of a live demo of our actual tool. So we get asked this question, or used to certainly a lot: what are the main differences and similarities between the incurred loss methodology and what we all have to focus on now, the CECL standard? So some of the main differences are that the CECL presents, in general, a longer term, more cyclical approach to losses. Instead of looking at losses on an annual or annualized basis, we're really trying to consider losses over the lives of the assets. So it's much more cyclical or pro-cyclical, so to speak. CECL is also more forward-looking, not waiting until losses are probable before managing them in the reserve. And thirdly, the old concept of impairment goes away along with FAS 5 and FAS 114 reserves. At least technically it is supposed to. FAS 5 and FAS 114 are replaced with the CECL standard. But then we mentioned right there that does any of that really go away? And from a practical standpoint, no, it does not, right? Loans that have similar risk characteristics, that have unique risk characteristics and can't be pooled with any other loans, like a mortgage loan that is in default and foreclosure is imminent, they still need to be culled from the herd and dealt with on a one-off basis or assessed individually. So those would be sort of in the past what you would consider your specific reserves as opposed to your general reserves. And here CECL treats them a little bit differently, but the same concept still applies. Also, the concept of qualitative factors certainly is not new under CECL. It's a big part of the incurred loss methodology, and it remains a big part of the CECL standard. So a lot of the work that you've always done from a Q factor standpoint still applies, and still can be used under CECL in a slightly different fashion. And I mentioned that it's all about making reasonable assumptions and then going about the process of justifying them. So if you think that CECL has somehow removed any bit of the subjectivity from the reserve process, think again. If anything, the CECL standard probably has more subjectivity included into it than the incurred loss methodology does. So, we need to remind ourselves that we're not doing this for our own enjoyment. Who are we doing this for, right? We're playing the same game as we always have been, and we're doing it with the same people. We just have a slightly different set of rules to get us there. From theory to practice, what I mean by that is, the standard and everyone's expectations, including our auditors' expectations, and their understanding of the CECL standard, as well as our regulators, has come a long way since CECL was first introduced back in late 2016. And since that time, a lot of the early theoretical considerations have been replaced by the practical realities. And this is something where that's particularly true for community banks. When a lot of these standards, whether they be regulatory standards like Basel or whether they be accounting changes like CECL, are done with much larger, sort of too big to fail sized institutions in mind. And the community banks tend to be sort of an afterthought a lot of times when they're designing some of these regulations, and they realize, and accounting rules. And they realized afterwards that, while they've designed this with bigger institutions in mind, the vast majority of the banks in the United States are, under $1 billion community banks. And so when you start thinking about what sort of methodology is going to get you across the finish line for CECL, and if you're considering some of the much more complex loan level methodologies, there's things you'll want to consider before going down that road. Does your current reserve consist primarily of qualitative factors? Given our recent relatively benign asset quality environment that we've had for a significant period now, basing your reserves solely on recent historical losses obviously is not going to get you to the reserve that's going to be required under incurred loss or under CECL. Is all the extra time, effort, and money of doing a much more complex methodology, loan level methodology, really going to change those facts? Do you even have the necessary loan level information to do some of those more complex methodologies? They require, 5+ years of you gathering that type of data, lots of metrics on every single individual loan in your portfolio, going back multiple, over an entire cycle or life of the loan historical period. And depending upon your loss experience, again, that extra analysis may or may not make any difference whatsoever in your reserve. No matter how detailed or granular you get, if your net charge-offs have been negligible over the last 5 years, you're not really going to be able to base or justify the majority of your reserve on your own historical data. Something that we've been hearing bits and pieces of, but the closer we get to implementation, the more we hear from the higher ups at not only FASB, but also at the bank regulatory bodies as well, that small banks simply don't need big models to comply with CECL. CECL is very much scalable, right? The adoption burden is expected to be commensurate with the size and complexity of your institution. Again, small banks don't need complex, overly granular loan level analyses in order to comply with CECL and calculate their reserves starting next year. One of the things we have learned from some of the early adopters is how critical parallel runs are going to be, not only in the process of introducing your auditors and examiners to what your reserve is going to look like under CECL, but also just understanding how we're getting from A to B, what kind of adjustments we're making and where in the portfolio that take us from our incurred loss, our current reserves for the 99% of us who haven't adopted CECL early, to what it's going to look like under a CECL approved methodology. And generally, banks, we found, are incorporating a lot of more peer data to supplement their own internal history. It's something I've already alluded to a couple times, and that'll be kind of a constant refrain as we go throughout this, that not only are we taking into account and doing analyses based upon your historical trends, we're also need to take into account the environment. And by the environment, I mean not only economic data, but also the losses that are out there in your marketplace outside your four walls. So while firsthand experience, while your historical experience is going to be the primary driver and justifier of what your reserves need to look like under CECL, peer data, apples to apples, segment level peer data is going to be a critical part of not only calculating, but also justifying your reserve and building that ever important narrative around why your reserve is the way you've calculated it to be. So submits, again, there is absolutely no mandatory method for CECL. It is your choice how you do the calculations. There have been lots of different methodologies put out suggested by FASB, suggested by the FTC and the OCC, and all the different regulatory bodies. And we've seen lots of offshoots of some of those methodologies or combination methodologies. It's really your choice, depending upon the size and your loan portfolio, what you're comfortable with and what data you have, right? Even if you feel like you need to do a much more complex loan level methodology for CECL, if you don't have the data to support it, you simply can't do it. We are all limited by the data that exists in the universe or in your universe, and we have to comply appropriately, and your examiners and auditors certainly understand that. But again, the vast majority of community banks don't need to engage in highly complex and expensive modeling. For most typical community banks, a straightforward call report segment driven methodology is perfectly sufficient. So this is why we introduced the CECLSolver. It is applicable to community banks of all sizes. We have over 250 or so community banks at least that are using our CECLSolver currently. They range from the smallest of community banks that have less than $50 million in total assets and one branch, up to, I think, some of our larger users are in the $3 to $4 billion size range. And certainly some of the larger institutions also do some ancillary additional analyses if they have particular segments of their portfolio that have had some hair on them in the past. But using our tool for the holistic approach is still something that's we see a lot of. You can tailor our tool to the unique characteristics of your bank. You can add custom risk pools. You can add custom qualitative factor adjustments. We'll go through all of that in a minute. And as we mentioned here, you don't need to be an expert in CECL accounting in order to start using our tool and get prepared for CECL. We can help as much or as little as you request or you require to kind of pull you across the finish line. Whether we're looking at some of your loan level data to help you with warm or weighted average remaining maturity calculations, or whether you just want some help looking over your scenarios when you built them to get a second set of eyes or a sanity check. We have our support team, as well as the designers, myself and the other designers of the tool, are available to you for audit support, for exam support. That's something that we do all the time and are happy to help with. In addition to the tool itself, we have a bunch of resources that are available to all of our CECL users. We have a visual user guide, which is kind of reminds people how to use the tool on an ongoing basis if it's been a while since they looked at it. A methodology guide that we've authored, as well as a white paper, some draft policy language that we have, and we're working on some more draft policy language as well to help get you on the way to rewriting your ALLL or ACL policy, as it were. To be CECL compliant. And we have other Excel spreadsheet type tools which can help you calculate the weighted average remaining maturities by bucket, if that's something that you want to take on and not have us do for you. And then also a bunch of external references to some of the better presentations that we've seen from the FASB, from the various regulatory bodies that pertain to CECL. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my browser and go take everybody through a live demo of the CECLSolver. So everybody bear with me for just a moment as I switch screens. All right, I believe now everybody should be able to see my browser window. This is exactly what the CECL tool would look like when you first log in, except obviously this is not your data. This is a sample institution. I believe our guinea pig for today is a relatively large community or a super community bank out of the Northeast, out of Maine. And so we sort of use them for some of these presentations sometimes. The only other thing that we've done is plugged in some warm values here so to get the ball rolling on the tool. But everything else looks exactly like it would when you first log into the tool. Couple things to remind everybody of. Since the entire tool lives in the cloud, every time you make any change in inputs or assumptions, the entire tool recalculates on the fly. So if you change a warm calculation, if you change a current balance, or if you change some peer assumptions or any of your qualitative factor adjustments, you don't have to plug in all your inputs and then click run and then try to download some sort of report and then compare it to another run of a tool. If you're trying to figure out exactly what impact a certain input or change in assumption has, that's a pretty much instantaneous feedback using our tool. Anything that you change, everything goes through the steps. It recalculates the expected future loss rate, recalculates the CECL reserve for that segment, and recalculates the entire CECL reserve for the whole portfolio. So you get sort of real-time feedback, which from a time perspective is extremely efficient. So you don't have to spend huge amounts of time comparing outputs of tools and trying to figure out which change in assumption or input really move the needle and which ones are relatively irrelevant given your situation. The other thing to remind you of is, because we're starting our segmentation around the buckets or the categories or pools that we can get from the call reports, we already have access to all of your historical data from your call report. So we've been aggregating all the call reports for all the banks in the United States for over 15 years now. And so when you first log into the tool for the first time, all of your historical balance data, charge off and recovery and past due data is already preloaded into the system. You don't have to spend any time reconciling accounts and plugging in data, historical data trends into our tool. They're already there. And that's on an ongoing basis as well. As soon as everyone finishes filing their call reports, for example, this is a great time to talk about that, because that would be at the end of this week. I'm sure everyone on the call is probably busy filing them or finishing filing them as we speak. But if you were to log into our tool next week, you would see everything has been updated. The current balances, the charge-offs and recoveries by segment, as well as the entire universe of peer data, all gets updated automatically on an automated basis when the quarter is over and everyone has filed. So let's just take a step back and walk through the tool from a step-by-step basis. The first step in calculating CECL, whether you're using our methodology, really, or any methodology for CECL, since CECL is at its heart estimating losses over the remaining lives of the assets, we have to get a feel for what those remaining lives are, meaning we have to do some average remaining maturity calculations. Now, that's the one piece of the puzzle that we can't get, at least not directly from your call reports, right? Nowhere on your 51s, does it ask you to do an average remaining life calculation for the loans that are in your for all the loans that are in your call report bucket? So that's the one place where we need some assistance from you guys to calculate those weighted average remaining maturities, those WARMs, and plug them into the tool as an input. But as I mentioned earlier, that's not somewhere where we leave you to the wolves for it. If the easiest way to get the WARMs is to see if there's a report that you can request from your core or ALM provider. Sometimes they do have WARM or remaining maturity type reports that you can request and can calculate it, as long as those WARMs are adjusted appropriately for prepayment assumptions. I need to make sure I mention that. So if you're using WARM calculations from a third party, make sure that there's some sort of prepayment assumption built in there, or at least make sure that you can adjust those for a prepayment assumption, and I'll show you how to do that momentarily. But we don't really hold our breath for a lot of assistance from the core providers there. So if you need to calculate your WARMs internally and you're kind of wondering about how to do that, we have an Excel-based WARM estimator tool that would show you exactly how you would go about calculating your WARMs. It's an Excel file that you can download here off of our site, and you can save it locally, use it as necessary. Or if you just don't have the time or the inclination to do those WARM calculations internally, and you don't have anyone you can really task that with, you can task us with it. We do that for lots of our customers as well. You say, listen, you just go ahead and securely upload your quarterly loan level data in a secure share file type site, the IDLR or the flat file or the loan tape, whatever you want to call it, on a quarterly basis. We'll take all that loan level data, cut and paste it, clean it up, organize it, and do the WARM calculations for you, and leave you an area where you can change assumptions like prepayment rates. So it's up to you. As little or as much assistance as you need in calculating those WARMs on the front end, we can provide. Now, I think enough said on that. Once we have the WARM values, then everything is driven from there. As soon as you plug in a WARM value, everything recalculates instantaneously on the fly across the board. Let's take an example, and we'll go with C&I loans. Let's say that we calculated the average remaining life of our C&I loans was 4.25 years. It's probably an overstatement, but let's do that. So if I plug in 4.25 years, it took just 1 second, everything just recalculated. And what I mean by all that is, if we know the average remaining life of our C&I loans is 4.25 years, we know what CECL is really requiring of us is that we project 4.25 years worth of future losses on our C&I portfolio, because again, CECL is about losses over the remaining lives of the assets. So if we're going to go about projecting 4.25 years worth of future losses, we start by looking at a 4.25 year period in your history and analyzing your experience historically. So by default, our tool takes a symmetrical view of a look-back period. A lot of other tools you may have seen in the past tend to use just an arbitrary 3, 5, 7, or 10-year look-back period that's the same for every segment of your portfolio. But intuitively, at least to us, it made a lot more sense to match the look-back periods to the durations of the WARMs, meaning if you're trying to estimate losses over the remaining life of a mortgage portfolio that has an average remaining, maturity of 10 years, we probably want to look further back in history than we need to look if we're trying to estimate, lifetime losses on construction loans that have maybe, 1 year average life. So that's what we've done here. And for C&I loans over 4.25 years, the aggregate historical lifetime loss rate for this sample bank is 4 basis points, not a whole lot there. Now, obviously, there's a lot of data that goes into that historical lifetime loss rate, but since the WARM methodology, which we're heavily utilizing the WARM methodology, there are some elements of open pool or snapshot methodology in our CECLSolver, but it is basically mostly primarily driven by a WARM methodology. All the supporting details that go into that calculation I just showed you on the summary are right here on the historical analysis tab. So it makes it very easy to track, trace, and audit all these calculations from cradle to grave. So you can follow from what you filed on your call report all the way straight through to what your CECL reserve is going to need to be without having to do that much work. Now, again, this historical tab, the first time you ever log in, will be preloaded with all of your historical data. So that's not something you have to worry about on an ongoing basis or even on an initial basis. If we're focusing on the C&I loans as our guinea pig, as I mentioned, first thing we're going to look at historically are balances. We want to track and see how your balances have changed in that segment. So over the last 4.25 years, we've highlighted that 4.25 year period in blue here, or teal blue, I guess, as it is. And we see that over that 4.25 year period, your balances have averaged about $363 million, or their balances have at least. So we get a feel for what their portfolio has done, or each segment has done balance-wise. Then we can expand and start looking at gross charge-offs, looking at that trend in charge-offs over the lifetime historical period. There's 4.25 years worth, just under $2 million in total aggregate gross charge-offs. Then we separately look at the recovery trend, so we can expand these subsections and get all that good detail if we need it. And again, for C&I loans, they certainly have had some significant recoveries trickling in as well, totaling about 1.8 million. So obviously, where the rubber really meets the road is net charge-off. So here's our net charge-off trend. As we can see, they had some net charge-offs each year for the past 3 years or so, but 4 years ago, they had a large net recovery. And if we look at that on toggle over to ratios, we can see all that on a percentage basis. And we see that the lifetime historical aggregate loss rate for C&I loans is 4 basis points. So that's kind of the detail that goes into this summary historical lifetime loss rate. So I'm going to take a quick breath. We're pretty much halfway through CECL, right? We haven't considered qualitative factors. We haven't looked outside our 4 walls yet, but we have analyzed your internal historical experience. Second half of CECL is all about the cumulative fudge factors, right? All those qualitative factor adjustments, all those reasons why we think current and future conditions might be somewhat different from the historical conditions which produced this. So how do we do that? We start with the historical, and then this page here is where we manage all of our qualitative factor adjustments. This part of our tool has certainly seen some enhancements and changes over the last couple years since we started offering the tool, as we've gotten more feedback from accounting firms as well as from the various bank regulators. We've kind of modified and enhanced this page. That's something that you'll notice as we go along here with our tool. This is a living, breathing document or model or tool, so to speak, because the expectations that we've seen around CECL have already migrated significantly since they first came out with the tool, came out with the methodology. We fully expect that after everyone is complying next year, we're going to continue seeing changes in practical realities and expectations from examiners and everything else. And as we see those, we will certainly keep the tool up to date and continue touching it up and enhancing it as necessary. That's where customer feedback is also extremely helpful. We rely on our users, of which we have hundreds now, to give us feedback when they finish an exam, when they finish an audit, as to what they liked, what they didn't like, what they'd like to see more or less of. And when we see a trend developing there, we certainly go back in, update the tool, and then we'll have a webinar and send you plenty of documentation around the changes that we've made to make sure everyone is kept apprised of all the changes. Now here I've plugged in a couple sample qualitative factor adjustments, but this is where kind of holistically we can manage the Q factor part of the process. As you can see here, all the same segments of a loan portfolio, and here are all the potential qualitative factor adjustments, an adjustment based upon peer experience. This is particularly helpful when you whether your bank has seen significant turnover in lending staff or loan portfolios, and you just don't think that your own history is really that honestly relevant in what your expectations are moving forward. You'll want to sort of downplay your own experience and put more weight on what other banks around you have experienced from a loss perspective, or simply if you don't have any losses in a portfolio over the last few years, yet you know intuitively you're still going to have to justify a significant reserve on that segment, but you don't have the losses to explain it. That's when you look outside your walls, you see what kind of losses are in the marketplace around you from your peers, in that particular segment of the portfolio at the segment level. And you could then make adjustments based upon peer experience. You can also make adjustments for economic conditions or other external factors. And then here, all these internal qualitative factor adjustments. The guidance that we got, these are not new qualitative factor adjustments. This comes from, the suggested Q factors that came from the interagency regulatory guidance that we've had for over a couple decades now, right? I believe that one of those policy statements, the interagency policy statement from 20 years ago or so, this one on allowance for loan losses, discussed those suggested ones to consider, and we've sort of faithfully recreated all of them here. Now, if you've had no changes in, lending management or staff, or you don't make adjustments based on some of these suggested Q factors, you simply remove them. I can remove any one of them as I see fit. After you make any of those adjustments, you can also add custom qualitative factor adjustments as well. And hold on one second for me. Just got to refresh the page since I think I clicked on the wrong button there. Hold on for me just 1 second. As you can see, there's no limit on how many scenarios you can build. I might as well jump to that just momentarily. Once you've finished plugging in all your inputs and assumptions into our tool, you save it as a scenario, just like I did up here. You can save as many scenarios as you want. There's no limit to how many you save. There's no additional cost for saving additional scenarios or having additional seat licenses or anything else. So as a best practice, we highly suggest whenever there's new data or whenever you change any significant assumptions that you go ahead and save it as a new scenario, so that you can track and trace and audit how your reserve is changing over time under CECL compared to your current reserve. Let me hop back into where we were. So again, with those qualitative factor adjustments, you can add new Q factor adjustments. You can remove some of these suggested ones, but as you make adjustments throughout here, not only does the net qualitative factor adjustment update on the fly, but also all these charts do as well. This is a great sort of summary chart that shows you kind of all the most relevant aspects of CECL for that particular segment. So if I click on a different segment of the portfolio, you get to see kind of in one visualization, what's your long-term trend in losses? That's the blue bars. What's your peers' long-term trend in losses? That's the green line. What's the look back period that you're using for this particular segment to start estimating reserves? That's the gray shaded area. And then the orange line is the total current CECL estimate based upon all the inputs. So if you had, let's say, a negative 20 basis point Q factor adjustment, you saw that orange line just dropped down and then recalculated. So all these charts are dynamic and update as you modify adjustments. If I, let's say, add another Q factor adjustment there, it all updates, the net adjustment recalculates, and then we have an administrative feature, just a note section. This is critical from an audit and an exam type standpoint, as important or probably more important than whatever your net adjustment is from a percentage or dollar standpoint, is your explanation of it, right? Document, document, document is what they always say, and explain. So this is where you're going to build that narrative around, this is what I was thinking, this is the justification or reasoning behind these adjustments that I made at this particular point in time. And so you can build that narrative. When you make these notes, they get attached to the risk pool, to each segment as you go. And so, when you print off or export this tool and share it externally, all those notes will be attached to the segment. So they'll provide that audit trail that you need. And then also internally, when you come back in next month to update your tool, or next quarter to update your CECL reserve, you want to be reminded of what you were thinking when you made the adjustments that you did last time around. So just a practical approach to that. You can also go upstream if you so desire. What I mean is, in addition to seeing your loss trends and your peers' loss trends, you can go upstream and see your trends in non-accrual loans for that particular segment and compare that to your reserve estimate. And you can go all the way upstream. And by all the way, of course, I just mean all the way in publicly available data. The first time that any potential problem loans become available from a publicly available call report standpoint are when they hit the 30 to 89 days. So you can go upstream and see that trend in 30 to 89 days to get a feel for more emerging credit trends right before they hit your losses. If I head back to the summary, so again, I can make all those Q factor adjustments. When I do that, it updates here in the net Q factor adjustment column. Something else to, again, because the tool is all in the cloud and updates freely, any changes you make to any other tabs, they're all linked and synced. So if you make a change in one spot, it changes everywhere else, so you don't have to worry about having an apples to oranges type situation. One of the most important Q factors that we can help with, as I already kind of talked about, was that peer experience. So that's why we have this green column here that just is for comparison, to compare your lifetime historical loss rate with something outside your four walls. So the way we are able to get this lifetime peer loss rates is by doing the same analysis on every single other bank in your peer group as we're doing for you. So pretty much we're doing this whole analysis historically, where we're looking at balance trends, charge-offs, recoveries over time with all these custom look-back periods. We're not just doing this analysis for your bank. We're doing it for every single other bank in your peer group simultaneously in the background. So crunching millions of call report numbers in order to get this. What this represents is using perfectly apples to apples segmentation, right? All the same buckets as we have for you from the call report. We calculate historical loss rates for all the other banks in the peer group, and then we aggregate them over time using your look back periods, so we can effectively calculate average lifetime loss rates for your peers that are comparable perfectly to your historical loss rates, which is why the Q factors adjustments become so straightforward. Now, when I say your peer group, I'm sure I'm already hearing questions in your minds as well. What do you mean our peer group? You can build custom peer groups any way you want to. We start by default by simply having, hey, all the community banks in your state, what we call the QCBI Maine in this example, peer group. So we have a bunch of filters, geographic filters, as well as structural and financial filters that kind of determine what is a typical community bank and who are they. And if you have questions about how we determine who's in our community bank index, feel free to give us a buzz, and I'm happy to walk you through what that process looks like. But so we start by default by using all the community banks in your state. You can certainly use your UBPR peer group if you want to look at peer losses from that perspective, or any custom peer group that you build. Right here on our QwickAnalytics platform is a home page, so to speak, for custom peer groups. It only takes a few seconds to click on that and then say, hey, I want all the community banks between $100 and $500 million in Eastern Michigan, or in this MSA, or these 5 counties. It's very simple and intuitive to create a custom peer group. As soon as you create that custom peer group, you can choose it from this drop-down box. And when you click on it, all this data will update on the fly. So it'll wipe clean, and it'll pull all this historical loss and balance data and charge-off data for all the banks in your peer group, however you want to define it. And once you have this peer data, it can be utilized lightly or heavily as much as you see fit as a qualitative factor adjustment, especially for segments where you simply don't have any recent losses and need to justify your reserves. Pretty common thing to have happen. Now, heading back to the summary page, once we have our Q factors in order, we've arrived at an expected future lifetime loss rate, simply our historical experience, plus or minus the sum total of all the changes we think we might have to it, equals to what we expect moving forward. Once we have that ratio, we need to apply it to our current loan balances. So by default, this is going to pull up the most recent call report data, quarterly data. That's all that we have access to publicly, but you'll notice these are all overridable, because it's not meant, that does not limit how often you run our tool or when you run it as of. If you want to run your tool as of October 27th, you can come in here and plug in your current balances as of today from your GL, and then this analysis will be as of whatever date you plug those in. And you can update the date up here just as a reminder as to what date your loan balances are. Once we have those, this is also where you can adjust your loan balances to exclude any balances that are outside the scope of CECL completely. For example, if you still had a little PPP loans, hiding on the books, let's say you had 10 million in COVID loans still sitting in your C&I portfolio, I'd come in, I'd net 10 million out of your current balance and make a note here that we netted out 10 million PPP. That would apply for not just PPP or COVID loans, but really any balances where you have no risk of loss, right? Whether, or simply are outside the scope of CECL completely. If you have a large portfolio of loans that are on the books at fair market value held for sale, that's outside the scope of CECL. If you have a large portfolio of government guaranteed SBA portfolio loans or partially government guaranteed, whatever is the guaranteed portion, you can also net out. So you'll want to think through that and certainly not apply loss rates to balances where you have no real loss liability from a reserve standpoint. Once we've done that, last piece of the puzzle is to cull from the herd and deal with any individual individually assessed loans that you have to. We've got a tab for doing just that. If you had a mortgage loan that you wanted to assess on an individual basis, you plug that information in here, and then it comes back in and pulls that out of the bucket so that we're not double counting said losses. And then once we have that, that's all the information we need to calculate a CECL reserve for each segment. We add up all the segments, we get a total CECL reserve for the collectively assessed pools. Then we add in any reserve for individually assessed loans, like I just showed. There's also a space now. We have a tab for the any CECL reserve for held to maturity securities. This is a pretty small piece or completely negligible piece of the puzzle for a lot of the banks that'll be on the call today, but it is a thing. We do need to do an analysis of our held to maturity securities portfolio to see if we do have anything on the books there that has any real credit risk. So this is just for the held to maturity securities portfolio, and it's just for those that aren't government guaranteed. So if all your HTM securities are government guaranteed or GSE types, there's really no risk of real credit loss there. So you don't have much to worry about. It's just if you have any, corporate debt or other securities that have real risk of credit losses, when you would plug that into here and it would play into the summary here. Once we've dealt with that and our individual assessments, there's also it's always one more it seems, last line item for unfunded commitments. So under CECL, FASB has kind of taken a somewhat fresh look at reserving for your unfunded commitments. It's already a line on your call reports. In the other liabilities section of your call reports, there's also already a line item for current allowance for off-balance sheet credit exposures. There's gonna be a little bit of a renewed emphasis or focus on that starting next year once we're all doing this from a CECL standpoint. And so we wanted to provide a module for that to help you guys calculate it, even though it's another relatively small piece of the puzzle for most of you on the call. The way we go about doing that, or you would go about doing that, we start with your total unfunded commitments and we break them down into some buckets as much as we can. We can get that data from the call reports as well, so that's already preloaded from your call reports. We work with you to figure out if any of those unfunded commitments are unconditionally cancelable or meet the accounting definition of unconditionally cancelable, which would include things like credit card loans, sometimes HELOCs, sometimes not, depends on how you write your contracts. Then we net those out and we don't have to worry about them from a CECL standpoint. And whatever's left over, that's your net unfunded commitment. That's the amount we have to deal with from a CECL standpoint. Now, this is where we have to start jumping through some mental hoops, because in effect, what they're really asking you to do here is estimate future long-term losses on loans that don't really exist yet, right? So it's all a bit hypothetical. But those steps you need to take are estimating how likely the probability of funding is, what percent, what balance of these commitments are actually going to be funded within a reasonable period of time, what is the average length of your remaining commitment, and what kind of losses might we see if those loans were to be funded. And so we give you some default values here to help you along the way. We give you some guidance in the footnotes. And once you're done looking at that and changing any assumptions, it does calculate some sort of an estimated CECL reserve for your unfunded commitments. and then we can compare that to any allowance you already have for the off-balance sheet stuff on the call report, if any. Most of you probably don't probably have a 0 there on your call reports, and then whatever's left over, the balance is your surplus or shortfall. This particular bank already had a large line item on their call report there, and they're probably going to need less under CECL, so they're probably going to see a little bit of a surplus there. Most of you will have a bit of a shortfall. Heading back to the summary, once we've taken care of that, we've now pretty much calculated your total required CECL reserve. We can compare that to your current reserve as of that same point in time, and we'll let you know whether you have a surplus or a shortfall compared to your current reserve. So on a sort of parallel basis as of whenever you plugged in your current balances. So those are the steps that you would take to run the tool on an ongoing basis. Again, once you've gotten all your inputs the way you want them, make sure that you save it as a scenario, give it a name, give it a date. You can save as many scenarios as you want. Once you have a scenario and you have it saved, you can access it, or anyone on your team can access it anytime they need to in the future. And you can export that tool. You have full control over how much you export, whether you want to just pull a summary results for your board on a quarterly basis, or whether it's time for an exam or an audit and they want the whole shebang, all the nitty gritty. You can select all the detail, but you have control depending upon your audience for an export as to how much data that you give them. You can export everything into a PDF or directly into an Excel environment. Nice thing about the Excel export, it allows you to do further work on it if you want to add columns or rows, make some notes, and then still be able to print it off in a readable, organized fashion. The Excel export retains all the spacing and shading and visual formatting that the interactive tool does. So it's still very printable and sort of followable even in the Excel environment. Let's say I wanted the summary and I wanted peer data and Q factors and I wanted that as a PDF. I'll show you what that works. It just pops up a new tab in your browser and exports it directly to PDF pretty much on the fly. So there is our PDF, including any notes that we might have made at the segment level that are applicable to our qualitative factors or any other parts of a tool. And at this point, that's pretty much how the tool works currently. I already talked about the resources tab we have there that kind of helps you along the way, not only with some internal guidance, but also some external guidance. If you want some some light reading on background for CECL or warm methodology appropriateness for community banks or whatnot, that's all right there. We also we followed the Fed closely when they were developing their scale tool last year. We decided that despite some of the very obvious limitations and shortcomings that the scale tool has, that we wanted to offer it as sort of a backup or secondary methodology available on our tool here, or simply just if you were morbidly curious as to what your CECL would look like from a scale perspective. We sort of built it into our tool here. So if you click on that, you get access to all the data that goes into a scale-based. I don't know how many of you are intimately familiar with the scale tool and the LE tool from the Fed, but the scale tool really starts by looking at peer data and then adjusting peer experience for your unique characteristics in order to do a reserve calculation. So it's a little bit backwards in some of its methodology, and it's very limited from a segmentation standpoint. There's only 6 total buckets that the Fed uses in the scale methodology, and that's because these are the buckets that come from that Schedule RIC, the disaggregated loan loss reserve data that comes from, that we can get from your call reports. And I'll show you in a minute what some of that data looks like. That's good information to have, even if you're never going to use scale or anything else. Getting some idea of what some of the bigger banks have been doing from a reserve standpoint, at some segment level, not a lot of segments, but with some segmentation, can really help you get a feel, not just what the absolute reserve level is for real estate construction loans, for example, for all the $1 to $10 billion banks out there, but what direction that loan loss reserve rate has gone over the last couple of years, right? That gives you a feel for what direction the industry is headed from a reserve standpoint, with a little bit of granularity at least. So you can go through these, you can change these assumptions, and you can create some scenarios from a scale tool perspective and export that as well if you're curious about running it that way. At this point, I think I've shown just about everything on our interactive tool, so I'm going to swap back to our PowerPoint presentation and finish it off. So if everyone will just give me another minute here to get back to the PowerPoint presentation. Here we go. I believe everyone should be able to see that again. So in addition to, I know I did all that in a live demo of in the browser. I wanted to have some actual screenshots here that we made some notes on, so that if you are, we'll be sending everybody a copy of the presentation after the webinar. It'll probably be tomorrow morning by the time we get that email out, but it will have not only a recording of this entire webinar, audio and visual, but also a PDF output of the PowerPoint presentation here that we're working off of. And so if you want to print that off, I have some summary slides that kind of summarize how the tool works. I've already discussed all this, so we're just gonna kind of breeze through it here. That's the Q factors tab. That's where those suggested qualitative factor columns come from. That's the individual assessments, the held to maturity securities, the Fed scale tool. This is another page on our QwickAnalytics platform that gives a lot of the data. This is the data that pretty much goes into and defines the scale tool. So we've gone in and pulled all the $1 to $10 billion banks around the country and analyzed what their reserve levels from Schedule RIC, I believe it is, those that have to fill it out, what direction they've been trending in. So this is a great page for just reference guide for what direction reserves have been headed in the recent past. We are also just recently kind of updated some of our guidance on prepayment assumptions. For most of you, you're probably not going to go through the time and energy of doing a really detailed historical prepayment speed analysis. That can be a pretty time-consuming process. If you can do a prepayment speed analysis from a core or ALM provider, that's great. If you don't have the time or energy to do that and you can't get that data externally, we do have some resources to help you start estimating prepayment rates for things like the weighted average remaining maturity calculations. So we give you some guidance here. The FHFA has a prepayment monitoring report that they update quarterly, which is a great reference for mortgage-related loans. There's a link to it here. This is one of the better charts that you can use to estimate long-term annual average prepayment rates for mortgage loans around the country. So that's a good starting point for prepayment assumptions. There are also a couple places you can go and get at least some data, even if it's a bit dated, on prepayment industry prepayment speeds for other non-mortgage related loans. So we have some guidance there as well. This is all in our resources tab of our tool. And again, if you're having difficulty calculating your WARMs using that loan level data it's just a matter of slicing and dicing your portfolio, taking the loan level data and organizing it into the call report segments if it's not already there, and then making sure that loan level data is clean of errors, and then doing some basic calculations in order to get weighted average remaining maturities. If that's not something that you want to do internally and can get easily from your core, just let us know and we'll tell you what the process would be for us to handle that on an ongoing basis for you. That's most of the information that we need. We don't need that much information to do a WARM. We don't need 75 data points on each loan. We need like 5. So don't hesitate to call us and ask us about that. Again, for some of our bigger institutions that like to use our CECL tool from a holistic perspective at the portfolio level for their portfolio, but still want to occasionally do some loan level analysis to zoom down into that proprietary loan data and start analyzing emerging credit trends, we can help with that as well. We have a whole separate side of the group that we call IntelliCredit you can upload your loan portfolio into our IntelliCredit portal and do some really next level analysis, credit analysis on there. It's some really sleek stuff, if I do say so myself. What are your next steps? Call us, shoot us an email. We're happy to just like I did on the walkthrough today. If you want, we can do a walkthrough of a tool with you and your team looking at your data. So we spend most of that walkthrough talking about your specific situations. You know, what do you need to add a custom segment because you have one call report bucket that really is two very different products? Do you need to make some significant adjustments to your historical experience because of a big change in management, or you did an acquisition 3 years ago, or what have you? We talk a lot about your specific situation in those walkthroughs. So feel free to give us a buzz, and we'll set up a time to go through that data with you and your team. And at this point, I'm about out of time. I tend to be a bit of a talker, so I'm actually happy that I got it done and accomplished without Sean egging me on in less than an hour. So hopefully everyone's appreciative of that. We do have a coffee talk series that we do every single month. We've been doing it for this whole year. It's been an extremely popular format. For us, we have a couple hundred community bankers show up every single month and join us for this coffee talk. It's where Sean O'Brien, the president of QwickRate, and I just have kind of an open forum to talk about trends, things we see happening that are CECL related, from conversations with the auditors and examiners to some of the chief accountants over at the FDIC and OCC, and what we're learning in the trenches. And people can ask questions. Anyone calling in can ask questions, and we'll answer them live on the fly. We tend to try to get some guests to join us. I know everyone's probably tired of hearing us speak about CECL, so we try to bring in auditors. We haven't brought in an examiner yet. We're working on that, but we have brought in a couple accounting firms to speak as well, that you can ask direct questions from auditors about our tool and about CECL. We will have a guest auditor on the call next month on November 18th. So please feel free to join us then. Even if you can't make the session on the 18th at 10 a.m., register for it anyway, because even if you don't make it, anyone who's registered will go ahead and send you a link to the entire presentation so that you can watch it at any time you've got some free time. So with that, thanks everybody for joining us. I really do appreciate your time today. And reach out if you have questions, whether you're looking to move, whether you have a solution for CECL and you're looking for something different because it's not working for you, whether you've just started and you feel like you're late to the party and you're wondering if you can possibly get the ball rolling in the next few weeks to be in time. That's not a problem whatsoever. We can get you up and running extremely quickly. Or whether you already have a primary methodology and you just feel like you need some more backup. You need another tool that's kind of a sanity check to your primary CECL methodology. Our tool can serve as that as well. So thanks again for your time today, and I look forward to talking with each of you soon.